And now, at last, we're about to begin. I would like to introduce the indispensable City Debates co-organizer and series moderator, David Beers, founding editor of the Itai. As David has been writing and editing journalism about cities, urban design, and solutions for over 30 years, I cannot imagine anyone more qualified to moderate these debates. So thank you so much for all your help, David. And now, let the show begin.
Thank you, Leslie, for that very kind introduction, and welcome everybody to the first of many city debates. I want to just emphasize that this series is, as you can tell, quite a team effort, and I've been privileged to see the intelligence and passion and goodwill that so many have poured into making this event happen. I want to also say that while these are called city debates, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. They are meant to matter to the region and reflect the concerns throughout the Lower Mainland. And tonight's discussion of density is about everywhere, not just Vancouver. And I just also want to note that the idea of a debate, it sounds very two-sided. But simply two-sided, it's kind of binary. I'd rather think of this as two facets in a very large, multifaceted chunk of challenges and issues and problems. And we're not going to resolve everybody's tensions and issues tonight, but we're hopefully going to have a very thoughtful and hard-fought debate about the resolution that I'll be discussing in a minute. As I say, we're hoping this can be an ongoing series beyond this one, and that taken as a whole, this series of debates will give a platform for as many perspectives as possible. Upcoming, we are going to have debates about towers. Are they evil or good? It might be put a little more elegantly than that. We will have a debate about how much citizens should be involved in the planning process. I can't see that as being controversial at all, but we'll have that as a debate. We'll have one about maybe housing affordability. That seems to be an issue these days. So, as I said, this is the first of many, and over time, hopefully, many facets of the urban issues of our region will be explored. Now, in a minute, I'll be explaining tonight's debate format and ways that you can be involved, and you will be very intimately involved this evening. And then we will invite the debaters on stage to let the arguments flow. But for now, a few words about tonight's resolution, including some context. Now, the Oxford style of debating, which this is, requires a resolution that is argued strongly by one side and then strongly argued against by the other. And this is our resolution tonight. Note that it does not resolve that all neighborhoods be densified intensively. That would be a different debate. Nor does it resolve that all neighborhoods be densified equally. No, what it resolves is that no neighborhood should be off limits densification. And one of our debate teams will argue, damn right. And the other will argue, no way, sucker. Right now, that wasn't very Oxfordian, so I'm going to have to... I will endeavor to be more Oxfordian the rest of the evening. Now, it's been noted and with justification, rightly so, it's been noted that all four of our debaters have at some point in their public lives argued for densification in some mode, in some places. Those bona fides are perfectly in keeping with both sides of this proposition. It is quite possible, for example, to be for densification in some circumstances without agreeing with the proposition that we read here. And I know that you're itching to get going, but I do want to make a few contextual remarks, and I'll try to keep them short. Allow me to share with you some statistics drawn from the most recent census, and you might find these surprising, or you might not, because the room is full of smart people who know a lot about this stuff. Did you think that the city of Vancouver is the most dense in Canada? It's not. It's third behind Toronto and Montreal. Did you think that the city of Vancouver is adding population a lot faster than the rest of Canada? It's not. It's not even keeping up with the average population growth rate for the rest of Canada. Did you think that all parts of Vancouver are filling up with more people all the time? Does it seem like that from the window of your house or your condo? All parts of Vancouver are not filling up with people all the time. As a matter of fact, 15 out of 38 neighborhoods west of Cambie Street decreased their population over the last census period. In fact, the bulk of the population added to Vancouver as a city was added downtown, with significant upticks in the Fairview Falls Creek area and the UBC and endowment lands. A few more stats locating Vancouver within its region. Did you think that Vancouver has set the pace of growth for the Lower Mainland? Percentage-wise, not even, not by a long shot. Vancouver's population grew by 4.8%, while Surrey's grew 4 times as fast, 18.6%. So would you guess that Surrey is the region's fastest growing city? The hot spot for density conflict? No, that would be Port Moody, apparently. Port Moody, at least percentage-wise, is growing faster. So you can see how statistics, depends on how you use them. And yet, here's an interesting statistic. A poll taken last year found 9 out of 10 people in Metro Vancouver said they wanted no more people moving into their city. 9 out of 10. Stop already, they said. The same sentiment was overwhelmingly expressed in Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary, so we're not particularly misanthropic here. It's kind of a common thing in Canada's large cities. You don't have to be misanthropic, actually, to be worried about population growth and densification. It's a very real anxiety and feeling, and it's meant to be treated with respect this evening, and that's why this is a two-sided debate. This feeling, stop already, no more people, is felt even though, based on projected growth in jobs, Metro Vancouver's population, Metro Vancouver's projections say the Lower Mainland's population, which already tops 2.3 million, will add 1 million more people in the next 25 years. 9 out of 10 people say no more people. Metro Vancouver projects 1 million more. The city of Vancouver is forecast to absorb about 140,000 of those, and every city in town is expected to grow by 25% or more, according to those projections, but they're just projections. Of course, there's no law that says this has to happen, but it also would be near impossible to create laws to completely prevent this from happening, which means that some densification will occur in some areas throughout the Lower Mainland. Now we come to a question of equity. Where will that densification occur? What is fair and what is not? Most neighborhoods, will they have to change their character as a result? That's a lot of people. The answers will very much be shaped by 3 Ps: planning, policies, and pressure applied by citizens. 3 Ps, not P3s. There's enough urban geeks in this room to know what a P3 is. Maybe that's a different debate. But these 3 Ps, planning, policies, and pressure applied by citizens, hopefully will be informed more deeply and thoroughly by tonight's debate. That is our hope. Okay, so now some words about how the evening will go. Some nuts and bolts. In just a few minutes, we will ask you to vote on tonight's resolution. In just a few minutes, before we even have the debate. That's right. You will be invited to vote before hearing the debate, and I will explain how to do that when the time comes. We will quickly tabulate the results, and we'll let you know the results before the debate even starts. So you'll all know how you all feel before the debate starts. Then the debaters will do their very best to try and change the minds of those of you who disagree with it. Here's how the debate is structured. First, each member of the 2-member debate teams will give opening statements. Then I will moderate an exchange period in which the debaters will be able to go at each other with me refereeing so it doesn't get really ugly. And you will be invited as well to contribute comments, points, questions, to involve yourselves in the debate. Then each debater will give a closing statement, very brief. And when the debate is completed, you will be asked again to vote. The team that wins the debate is the one that changed the most minds. That's how we decide who wins tonight. And there's a very fancy trophy for whoever wins. And whoever comes in second gets some nice t-shirts. So that's what's at stake here tonight. All right, then. I'm now going to invite each of you to cast your vote. We have the results. In this room, the number of people for the resolution, open every neighborhood to densification, was 145, and the number against the resolution was 39. That means 79% were for the resolution. Yes, open my neighborhood and all neighborhoods to densification, but just don't let any more people come into the city. And clearly the 1 out of 10 all came tonight to this thing. And 21% said, no way, do not open all neighborhoods to densification. Okay, as I explained, when tonight's debate is finished, we will poll you again. The side that gets the most votes might still be the one that has won the first vote. But that won't decide the winning team. The team that wins is the one that changed the most minds, as evidenced by the second vote. So let's meet those teams. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to rumble? In an extremely outstarting way. Very good then. I invite to the stage now tonight's esteemed debaters. Bring on the debaters. Welcome, debaters. Arguing the pro position tonight. Yes, open all neighborhoods to densification. We have the team of Brent Toderian and Joyce Drohan. It's okay to flex a little if you want. Joyce is an architect and an urbanist whose focus is sustainable communities. And her teammate, giving off strange alien signals, is Brent Toderian, and he was Vancouver's chief planner and is a consultant and commentator about urban design. You'll be able to read their more lengthy bios in your program. Arguing the con position tonight. No, do not open all neighborhoods to densification. We have the team of Michael Goldberg and Sam Sullivan. Closest to me, Michael Goldberg is a professor at the UBC Sauder School of Business and, among other things, chairs the Surrey City Development Corporation. Sam Sullivan is former mayor of Vancouver and MLA for Vancouver Falls. Side note, I believe Brent was director of city planning while Sam was mayor. So tonight,
I had to be polite.
I was going to say, tonight we may get a taste of the arguments that went on behind closed doors in the City Hall. All right, on to the first segment of the debate. Each debater will now be given 7 minutes to make an opening statement. I encourage you in the audience to take mental note and maybe actual notes, because as I said earlier, you will be invited in the middle of tonight's event to contribute your comments and points. We begin with Joyce Drohan arguing for the resolution. You have 7 minutes, starting now. How about starting as soon as your slide is? Just to be fair.
Good evening. By 2041,
Don't touch it. I said we're not supposed to lean into it.
We'll turn it up.
Can't hear you. Try again.
by 2041, we may be seeing as many as 170,000 residents joining us here in Vancouver. The problem is, Vancouver has a very small landmass, 1/6 the size of Edmonton, 1/8 the size of Calgary. We've been dealing with growth and doing it creatively as early as the 60s. When the West End was transformed from a wood frame Victorian neighborhood to a neighborhood that became, in the course of approximately 12 years, one of the densest neighborhoods in Canada. South Downtown followed, Cole Harbour, and before you know it, the downtown's almost built out. So what's happening? The density's moving out into our neighborhoods, and it's causing a lot of grief. It's getting people very angry, creating animosity between residents, between developers, and the city. It's excruciating, it's expensive, and I would argue that it's undermining our goal to house future populations. This heat map of Vancouver shows some of the major developments that the city of Vancouver is anticipating over the next 25 years. But there is a shortfall, and you can see the blank areas on the map. Those are the neighborhoods. Do they have a role in this? I contend that they do. I would suggest that we do open all neighborhoods to density, primarily because they already are. We've been doing density in neighborhoods for decades. I think we should continue this and really start to work with the neighborhoods to help create a bit more of a balance. Sorry, I can't get this to work. Let's start with the humble laneway house. How many of you actually knew that 2,000 laneway houses have now got building permits associated with them? That's pretty exponential growth over the last 6 years. And if you extrapolate that to 25 years, these forms of development could actually be accommodating quite a good number of people. Sorry. I'm just going to flip quickly by these last two. This is the kind of quiet density that I believe should be encouraged in neighborhoods. And I think along with it, to create the balance that I believe needs to happen in neighborhoods. It's very frustrating. We need to look at the successes of our mid-rise communities. London, of course, has a much more serious problem than we do, but they've just recently completed a study on how to intensify their own low-density neighborhoods. And the findings were unequivocal. Mid-rise forms are by far the most robust, the most flexible, the most cost-effective, and the most versatile. Southeast Falls Creek is probably our best example of mid-rise versatility, primarily in the way that it can be used to shape an incredible public realm and also to support a very rich array of amenities and neighborhood-serving uses. I think it's become an indisputable destination for the city and a place that I think a lot of people now see as a huge success. So how do we build on that? Well, we're doing it right now along the county corridor as well. Many of these projects, and we're involved, my firm is involved in a number of them, are actually trying to do the same thing, which is create a public realm beyond that half-block density that the corridor is currently putting in place. But I think the lesson from the county corridor that's most interesting is the fact that it's not a corridor. These larger developments are actually starting to create a very broad band of development that's creating these very rich environments right up against the neighborhoods. And this becomes the kind of balancing act that starts to give back to the surrounding lower density neighborhoods and creates a kind of synergy between the two. I'm sorry. I'm going to leave you with a proposal that a young group of architects and designers in our office put together that's, you'll find somewhat controversial, but the idea is this. We're not anti-tower. I'm not anti-tower. I do believe in the density of the corridors and the density of the transit nodes, but here's a thought. What if that half block of density was actually expanded to several blocks? These folks were, the folks in our firm were inspired by the work of Salvador Rueda, who has done an incredible job in the city of Barcelona looking at the super block and actually capturing public realm by reconfiguring blocks and closing selectively streets to capture public realm and create a whole network, a citywide network of mobility networks. So in summary, I'd like to suggest that I think it is through more quiet density and more mid-rise density that we can start to create a real balance between the higher density forms that we're seeing along the corridors and the single-family neighborhoods that so many people desperately want to preserve. Thank you.
Even with the glitches, Joyce came in 47 seconds early. And so that's 47 seconds of your life that she has just given you for later. And I think that's fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, Joyce. And now arguing against the resolution is Michael Goldberg.
Okay, thanks. I put together some pictures. I spent a nice day driving around to get my arguments together in a visual way. The first question is, why do we densify? I think we densify lots of reasons to increase housing supply and try to moderate the price rises. I think we want to add to opportunities for people to age in place and have more complete and diverse neighborhoods in terms of population base. We want to create demand for commercial services. I drove around Dunbar in the process of taking these pictures, and it's not a pretty sight. What is lacking is people, and people come with density. So we need to create that kind of demand and provide opportunities for more kinds of housing at the same time for our growing diversity in population. I need to build on transit. We have not made the best use we could of transit to date, and not just rapid transit, but bus transit as well, and taking advantage of transit to increase very livable housing by expanding density on transit routes, to me, is very important. And conversely, create ridership for our troubled transit system. So to me, where to densify is BS, and it's being selective and being smart. So let's get into what I see as being selective and smart. The argument I'm making is, let's focus on major arterials and shopping districts and shopping centers. Laneway and infill housing is nice, as we've seen. It can add a fair number of people, but the scale of population growth we're talking about is much greater than those intensifications can hold. So I think we need to be very creative, and we need to think of mixing uses that we haven't thought about before. Mechanica is an interesting opportunity on First and Quebec, where it's named after an old Italian auto shop, and instead of allowing the auto shop to stay on the first floor and keep the jobs, it was deemed that that wasn't a good use of the land, and therefore we should just keep it for housing. And I think opportunities to mix what used to be unmixable uses is very important. Housing and offices in the urban core, I don't see why we have this restriction on no condos in the core itself. Why can't we have cores, offices and condos? Condos are actually big employment factories. I don't think we should protect industrial land. I think industrial land represents a huge source of residential land. Again, an opportunity to create new uses that are more intense, and if we intensify industrial uses, then we have more land to use for residential uses. Later I'll get into mixing industrial, warehouse, or now it's called logistics use, and condo towers. When you look at a 100,000 square foot warehouse, that's 2.5 acres of garden that you could build a tower on top of. And False Creek Flats, I don't know why we can't put housing there. I don't see auto dealers as being a particularly intensive use for jobs, and we could do more with that land. Raising densities in non-residential areas, I think, can accommodate both jobs and people, and having a labor force and a job market near each other, to me, makes great sense. So what are the places I see as densifying? I see neighborhoods like Kerrisdale and Dunbar arterials to protect the interior. I see other arterials like West Broadway, 4th, and Kingsway as being absolutely prime for densification. And major transit nodes like Commercial and Broadway, Main and Broadway should really have very high density, because there's enormous accessibility in those sites. And by greatly expanding housing supply and providing access, we can dramatically improve affordability, because affordability is the sum of travel and occupancy costs. And if we can lower both by building more housing on top of transit, we're away to the races. And then finally, redoing shopping centers, which we're well on the way to doing, but doing them on the scale that we're talking about in Oak Ridge and Brentwood. So in Kerrisdale, we tend to forget there actually are some mid-rise towers, and my suggestion there is let's do more of them. And when we look at that, it's not at all inconsistent with reasonably expensive single-family homes, and that land was densified for mid-rises 40 years ago. So there's nothing incompatible. Let's just do more of it. I don't know why we don't build that throughout Broadway instead of that. And 4-story buildings don't do it, but 7-story buildings and 8-story buildings could. And they provide more customers for their shops. Places like the Canby density, which is a 6-story building, I think is very necessary in places like Dunbar and Kerrisdale, along the thoroughfare, to replace the 4-story buildings, which are not very dense, and allow us to take the pressure off the interior of those neighborhoods, and at the same time provide a robust population to pick up the life of those declining commercial areas. I think we really densify major transit nodes, no Safeways, but something like the Solo District at Broadway and Commercial. The same thing at Broadway and Main. There's a 22-story building going in, but I see no reason why we shouldn't have something at least the scale of Gateway. Other densification of transit nodes, this is near City Hall, 1-story buildings on Broadway and Canby. We should have something more like that. And again, this takes pressure off the land around it. Looking forward, there's no reason why we can't have 2-story warehouses like that. Or, if prices really get high, we can have something like this 10-story warehouse that you own through Canada Pension Plan, which is about 8 million square feet. That replaces this, which is very land intensive, and it goes back to this, the old Canco building and the industrial buildings that are left in Gastown. And perhaps combining both industrial and residential, as is done in San Francisco and in California and Florida. So we can also put people in our port, like it's done in Rotterdam or Hong Kong. And in summing up, I think we should not densify all neighborhoods in all places. I think we should focus on very selective densification along major corridors, and by doing that, we expand supply, we expand the viability of commercial areas, and at the same time, we protect the unique residential character of the interior of these neighborhoods. That's it.
With 10 seconds to go. I feel like I'm useless up here. I thought I was going to be able to kind of crack the whip. Thank you, Michael. And now, Brent Toderian, it is your turn.
Do I have to advance one slide? All right, we're good.
Ready, go.
I'm going to take 10 seconds to thank the organizers for creating this, because I think this is a marvelous idea that we've been all waiting for a very long time, thanks to Ray Spaxman, who first introduced the word urbanarium to me. Now I better go fast. So it is my position that our neighborhood should be opened up to well-considered, well-designed, contextual density. For me, I'm a yes, but. You can quote me on that. To me, it's about how we densify our neighborhoods in a very non-one-size-fits-all way. For me, it's about the where and where not, the how and how not, the why and why not. And for me, I can agree with most of the context for densification that Mr. Goldberg just showed, and say that you can still completely agree with the idea that part of our growth should still be in the neighborhoods, although in a very contextual way. I have no problem with saying that the majority of our growth should be continuing downtown development, building along our arterials, particularly at fixed transit sites, but in other kinds of neighborhood nodes. We've been working on that for a very, very long time. But to suggest that the neighborhoods could then be frozen in amber and not change at all is contrary to what we've been doing in Vancouver, and I believe contrary to what we should be doing. So to me, it's not an either or, it's a yes and. Because if we're going to do our city growth well, we're going to have to look at a lot of different parts of our city, but in very different ways. I did not put that down. So, a lot of us have seen this slide before, and it's going really slowly for some reason, but we've been working for decades on building the downtown, transforming it. Boy, this is going to take all my 7 minutes. And it gets an awful lot of attention. And indeed, it's a challenge to make sure that as we continue to develop our downtown and in our other highly urban places, frankly, we don't overbuild. Because I think both of the gentlemen on the stage with me have at one time or another in my career pressured me to build more than I thought was appropriate on a particular site. And I think that's what happens when you try to put all your eggs in a few baskets. There's pressure to make things taller than they should be, bigger than they should be, within the context of a place. This is the rest of Vancouver, and indeed it's the rest of Metro Vancouver. We have a lot of different contexts to work with, and we can't afford to try to just pick a few spots or even a category of spots within our city and region and put all of our density there. A friend of mine in California introduced this term that I really like called the missing middle. It's all the different housing types between single family or single detached houses and mid-rise and above. And it's all the ground-oriented densification that people in many ways really like, because it still gives them a connection to their ground. It still reflects the general character and scale of low-rise neighborhoods. And frankly, in many cases, it's illegal in many parts of our city, many parts of our region, many parts of our country. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to do more of this type of housing, because not everyone wants to live in a condo. I live in a condo downtown, Sam lives in a condo downtown, but you do too? Do you? No. Not everyone wants to or should live in a downtown condo or even a condo on an arterial. A successful city provides many, many choices for many, many housing types, all of which improve our sustainability, affordability, resiliency, etc. When I was at City Hall, I called it gentle density. And I used that term along with hidden density and invisible density to suggest that as we go out and talk about change within the neighborhoods, boy, do we need a better conversation about how we talk about density and change in neighborhoods. We need to introduce new language, new narratives, etc. And to say that it's not about tall towers, it's not even necessarily about mid-rise. There's lots of ways you can have a conversation about how neighborhoods can play a role in the growth and change of the city, and not necessarily talk about those big scary forms that gets people awfully excited, or to say the least. So in my position, it's all sorts of different building types and different contexts. It's a lot of different choice. It introduces people into the neighborhoods, though, that supports walkable local shops, services, keeps the schools open, in many cases helps repopulate the neighborhoods. As we've said, a lot of the populations are changing and lowering, and in fact, we face this continued pressure of schools closing, etc. because of this. It's because you can't protect your neighborhoods from change, but in many cases, you can prevent it from the housing choices that actually give people options within their neighborhoods, choices within their neighborhoods, instead of freezing them in amber. The laneway housing program, which I led, is an example of that, and it actually has over 2,100 approved, I think now. It was an example of how you could introduce something. By the way, both the mayor at the time and, ironically, Joyce's boss, Peter Busby, both told me at the time, why are you bothering wasting time with something like laneway housing? Just jack up the density. That might not have been your words, Mr. Mayor. But just jack up the density at transit stations, because that's how we're going to save the polarized caps from melting. Well, that's a false choice from my perspective. The housing that we do in laneway housing is about nimbleness and resiliency in neighborhoods. It's about people being able to downsize within their neighborhood so they don't have to move out and give the primary home to their kids and their grandkids. It's about a place for the caregiver. It's about a mortgage helper or a rental unit within the neighborhood. It's about nimbleness and choice. And we do have over 2,100 approved now. And the point is that all of these didn't involve developers. They didn't often involve architects. They involved citizens who wanted different options within their neighborhoods. And I believe that as part of the context of growth within our city and in our region, this should be part of the conversation. Not necessarily the focus, but a part of the conversation. I've reminded Larry, your co-author, Jonathan Barnett, has one of my favorite quotes: it's not how dense you make it, it's how you make it dense. And I believe we need a much better conversation with the communities about how to do density of every scale, in every context, in a very highly designed way that frankly can make all of our neighborhoods more walkable, livable, sustainable, etc. Thank you.
15 seconds under. These debaters are very dense, may I say, ideas across. Thank you, Brent. Now Sam Sullivan will now argue for the con side.
Thank you. I have 7 minutes to speak. By the time I finish, 1,000 square feet of green space in our region will have converted to sprawl. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every second that goes by, 3 square feet of our region becomes urban. This wilderness could be saved if Vancouver could accommodate more growth. It took me years to understand how much damage opposition to density was doing to our local and global environment, and how much suffering it was causing young families and our economy. But when I did, I started the Eco-Density Initiative. Among the achievement, laneway housing, denser communities like the Olympic Village. None of these would have been possible without the solid competence of Brent, Joyce, Drohan, and other professionals. But I have also seen the political cost of densification. It is unreasonable to ask municipal politicians to risk arousing anti-density activists everywhere. Although it may be desirable to densify all neighborhoods, the effort could be so destabilizing. It could jeopardize the whole densification project. Not all density provides equal benefits. We must be strategic and densify where we get the most benefits. We have a political system that requires legislators, city council, to perform judicial functions, to render judgment on individual projects. Until that changes, an agenda that depends on local politicians committing political suicide simply will not succeed. Vancouver has achieved a lot. Almost every home can have a legal suite in a laneway house. Invisible densification is being realized throughout the city. But the next steps will be more visible and intrusive, and may risk a backlash. The question you must consider is whether Vancouver should densify all neighborhoods. So I reframe this question: should we densify a little a lot, or a lot a little? Is it better to densify the whole city a bit, or just parts of the city a lot? As a general rule, I would submit that moderate density brings moderate benefits. Higher density brings higher benefits. And density must achieve a critical mass before those benefits can be realized. Consider greenhouse gas emissions. A World Bank study concluded that people in the downtown Toronto create 1.3 tons of greenhouse gas per person. Those in the farthest suburb create 13 tons per person. Imagine, you can generate 10 times as much greenhouse gas just by moving from the downtown to the farthest suburb. In Vancouver, the differences are less severe. People in the downtown of Vancouver create 1.5 tons of greenhouse gas. Those living around the core, 3 tons. In the more suburban areas, 6 tons. If we add one more home to the city, why not generate lower emissions? Consider the number of people that can live in one block of high density. Go back one. So people, to accommodate the same number of people in high density and medium density would take at least 3 times as much land. In single detached homes, a minimum of 35 times as much land. As densities rise, the preferred mode of transportation moves from car to transit, bicycle, ultimately to walking. Our downtown is achieving high enough densities that walking makes up the majority of all trips. It isn't like we have to beg or coerce people to live in the most environmentally sustainable way. People want to live in high density, in or near the core. They will pay more per square foot of living space in a high density condo than in most lower density neighborhoods. The price of housing is a function of only 2 things: supply and demand. Density is how we increase the supply and bring down prices. Density has many other benefits. Professor Edward Glaser has shown that incomes grow as densities rise. Higher density creates conditions for greater inclusiveness, where people from different backgrounds interact. Where do you find businesses welcoming of those with different sexual orientations? In higher density areas. The possibility of a backlash is real. It happened before. In the 1950s and 1960s, detached houses in the West End were converted to residential towers. Rents dropped, quality of housing went up, and the West End achieved the smallest ecological footprint in the country. Towers were started in Kitsilano, Point Grey, Cambie area, but they triggered a political upheaval in the 1970s. The new government froze the West End, downzoned large areas of the city. House prices began their steady rise. Natural areas of the city were mowed over for sprawl. For the first time in the history of the city, the population actually dropped. The rising house prices and sprawl of today are an inevitable result of the reaction from those days. The market communicates to us through prices. Right now, the market is screaming. There are whole sections of the city where no average young person can hope to live, and it's getting worse. Yet the municipal system is deaf or very hard of hearing. The natural, organic densification that happened before cannot happen now. We need serious densification, we need it now. But we risk another political upheaval by attempting to densify all areas. We have done the densification that is subtle, without visible changes. We must ask ourselves, is it worth bringing more visible changes to all neighborhoods and risk a backlash? Let us densify where we can get the most benefits, in the core, on corridors, transit nodes. Densifying all neighborhoods, which might derail the whole effort, is something we should avoid. I submit to you that we should not densify all neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Now, excuse me a minute while I shift positions. Not going to get anybody with this one. Okay, now is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So I believe the Oxfordian term for what I'm doing here right now is sitting on high. And this is something I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to sit on high. Finally, I'm now sitting on high. Feels good. During the next 20 minutes now, during the first part, I'm going to invite the debaters to address each other directly and challenge each other's points, or try to reemphasize their own points. In other words, argue with each other. And then at a certain point, we're going to pause, and then I'm going to start inviting some comments and points from the audience. So let's start, since you had the first word, Michael or Sam, is there something that you want to say to your opponents?
Yeah, I'd like to reaffirm what Sam has said, and my concern is the scale of population that we can hold in these more diffuse and gentle densifications. And to me, a very large part of the survivability of a neighborhood is the viability of its commercial streets. And when you start to spread density evenly, it's not much different from Sam's urban sprawl. It's just the sprawl of density. And it's not all that easy for people to get to significant shopping streets. It's not that easy for them to get to transit. And as a result, I fear that that's just going to add to the carbon footprint that Sam set out and not really do much to make us a more vibrant, ecological, and enlivened city in these, what are essentially suburbs within the city.
Brent or Joyce, you have a remark?
Well, as I said before, I don't live in a condo. I live in Mount Pleasant, and I've lived there for a very long time, 20 years as a matter of fact. When I first arrived, my husband and I first arrived there, Main Street was a pretty desolate place, quite frankly. There wasn't a cafe to be found, nor a decent bakery. Well, that's changed, hasn't it? And I think it's largely to do with the fact that the density isn't just happening on Main Street, it's happening within the neighborhood, and people are welcoming it. It's enriched the neighborhood in a tremendous way, and I would suggest to you that can be happening, and it is to a certain extent happening in every neighborhood anyway. So why don't we embrace it and actually help it along? I don't think we're talking about putting towers into single-family neighborhoods. I certainly wouldn't support that. But I do think that we can go a lot further and be a lot more creative about helping neighborhoods to evolve over time. I think they're healthier places that way.
So Joyce, do you feel like every part of every neighborhood is not so intact and special in its character that it couldn't undergo the kinds of changes that you like in Main Street? I mean,
Well, isn't that a false narrative you just said? Every part of every neighborhood? That's not what we're debating. We're talking about every neighborhood, but we're not talking about every part of every neighborhood. And one of the things we said was where and where not, including within neighborhoods. Sorry to jump in.
What you said.
And while I'm at it, that was a lovely way to put it, Joyce. She's the good cop. I'm going to be the bad cop for a second here. I want to address the straw man that Mr. Goldberg just laid out and the false choice that Mr. Sullivan presented. The straw man is that you said we are suggesting that we're going to spread evenly. I think we said the opposite of that. I think we said that there are obviously going to be areas to focus density downtown, on corridors, around transit stations, and that within the neighborhoods we would take a context-specific approach. Who said anything about spread evenly? I don't recall that being a position in this debate. And Mr. Sullivan said do we choose between the whole city a bit or parts of the city a lot? I consider that a classic false choice, where I think sophisticated city making says we're going to be a little more artful about how we address strategic densification in a lot of different places, and it's neither of those two choices, and it involves an awful lot of conversation with neighborhoods.
Sam?
Okay, issue of, oh, do I have to turn this on?
It's on.
Okay, it's on. The issue of reaction, neighborhood reaction. So I've seen a townhouse create a firestorm, a protest. I've seen subdividing from a 50-foot lot to a 33-foot lot. People thought we were killing their children. It was horrible. Now, if you're going to have that much resistance to such a gentle densification, you know, you can pretty well get the same amount from a higher density. So you're going to get firestorm either way. And I don't think politicians can survive broad densification through all the neighborhoods. It's you know, very difficult to do, and I think we jeopardize this whole thing. So I guess the issue is the reaction you get from some neighborhoods on even very small densification.
Sam, now I hear the politician's logic there. Clearly you have felt directly that backlash. But I just want you to clarify, since you're arguing for not opening all neighborhoods to densification, is that the reason not to open a neighborhood densification? Because people are going to be very angry? That doesn't seem to be based in logic. It seems to be based in giving the squeakiest wheel what it wants. Do you not value what causes this backlash, this kind of concern about neighborhood integrity? Don't you see some kind of fundamental values there that must be protected?
It's a combination of recognizing political realities and what benefits do you get. So if you're going to go to the wall and do some densification, it better be worth it. You know, people will lose their jobs. Now, politicians actually like their jobs. You know, most people, you know, they get kind of enjoy it, and they come to enjoy what they do. And it's a very unstable life. And I know, you know, I personally, I'm a lot more able to handle the ups and downs because my life isn't completely all about politics. So, but I certainly have seen it on council over 20 years that some people are convinced that that vote is going to be the one that kills them and ends their career. So there's a very great risk averseness in politics, and we have to recognize that, and we've got to factor into the getting what is possible.
Comments from this table?
It's a bit surreal because I worked with Sam on eco-density, and in some contexts, you know, Sam created probably my biggest challenge in my planning career, and I've in some contexts called him the bravest politician I've ever dealt with, because he had the guts to put density on the front page of the newspaper, although he saddled me with the responsibility of figuring out what it meant. But I now work with politicians all over the world, and part of my job is to help position them for success in doing the right thing. Not to give up on doing the right thing because it's hard, but I actually use Vancouver as an example of a city that will have the hard conversation, hopefully the smart conversation and the hard conversation, and come out the other end better off. Because I don't believe, for example, I think I saw Francis in the audience, I still remember when Sam, I don't want to bring up a hard moment in your past, but when you were ousted from the MPA, Francis. I remember Francis writing specifically an article that said it wasn't about eco-density, and that there were other factors at play. And Francis Bueller, and I think you can. What I say to cities is you can have the tough conversation, but boy, do you have to do it smarter than we often do. And so I'm sympathetic to the position. It is harder, but I believe it has to be part of our responsibility, because if you think about it, an awful lot of our existing built form is either low density or suburban. And if we're saying that's off limits from change, that's a pretty powerful statement. I think we've got a bigger responsibility than that.
Yeah, I don't think Sam's saying it's off limits. He's saying you have a certain amount of political capital to spend. And the question is, do you spend that capital, spread it out for a gain which may not be as great as focusing it on the places you can really create lots of housing in highly accessible places. I lived in one of the more progressive neighborhoods in Vancouver, Dunbar. I remember there was a Safeway on 41st in Dunbar, and they demolished the Safeway and wanted to build a new Safeway, which is now an IGA. And they had this absolutely obscene idea of taking the houses on 40th, demolishing them and putting in a whole street of row housing, single-family row housing, to act as buffer between their enlarged Safeway. Not a chance. The fight going on now with Stongs is, should we have a 4-story building? Maybe touching a 5-story building? I mean, the kind of capital you have to spend on that, you might as well go whole hog and say, Main and Broadway, you're getting a subway station, you're getting lots of density.
Here's something that I would like to put to both tables. Both of you are offering a model of targeted density in certain parts of the neighborhood, leaving other parts of the neighborhood being either less densified, or I guess you're defining what might be away from the corridor, the actual residential area as the neighborhood, and then not affecting it. The part I love about my neighborhood is the arterial. That's my home. My home is not my 35-foot lot. It's walking over Main Street and interacting. And the thought that all that could be hyper-densified under either of your schemes, to the point where rents go up and the whole cityscape, the whole streetscape is changed, to me would be something I would fight against personally. And so I wonder what either of you would argue to reassure me.
Well, hyper-densified is a pretty powerful word.
Well, it's basically a 1- and 2-story kind of shabby streetscape at the moment, which is kind of lovable. And what's going in is 4-story kind of concrete block. So,
And is that hyper-densified in your?
to me, it's a shock. It's a shock of the new. It is a very. It changes the aesthetic feel and who can live as shopkeepers in that street.
Well, I don't think we're advocating for hyperdensity along the corridors. I think, the city's policy right now is primarily for 4- and 6-story buildings, and provided the right-of-way is such that it creates a reasonable proportion, then 4 and 6 stories is fine. I think one thing you need to worry about with some of our corridors and high streets, so to speak, particularly Dunbar's, is not having enough critical mass around it to support a really vibrant kind of set of neighborhood serving uses. And for that reason, I think over time, the 4-story, a couple of 4-story blocks along Dunbar is not going to get you there. So I do think that we need to think very differently about where density goes. And I think we're kind of, there's a real sort of gray area in this conversation as well, because I think we're agreeing on a lot of points and disagreeing on a few. But I think the one that I hear coming out is that we should be densifying the corridors. It's as Brent said, it's what does that density look like? And I contend that it should be the medium density. I'm not against towers. I think you can have towers, a number of towers within that fabric. But I think it's a density that people are really comfortable with. And you can build tremendous density if you start to think about going beyond that half block of the corridors.
I think if we need to start every conversation about density with some of the statistics you showed and talked about at the beginning. And it's like squeezing the balloon. If you don't put density in some places, more has to go to other places, presumably if we're going to play our role within the regional projection. And then you start to get conversations like what Mr. Goldberg said in his presentation about not protecting industrial land and putting housing in the CBD, and those are both positions I very strongly disagree with. We should debate on that sometimes. That would be a much more vigorous debate on my part. But I think that's what happens when you take things off the table. And if there was a sound planning rationale, or human scale rationale, or walkability rationale for trying to leave certain places alone, suggesting that they will somehow be better by being left alone and not depopulating or having their schools under threat of closure, etc., then I might be able to buy into it. But what I usually hear in that stable neighborhoods discussion, where it's leave the neighborhoods alone, we're going to put density here so we can leave the neighborhoods alone, it usually does come from the politicians. And I do consider it a political strategy more than I consider it a city-making strategy.
Response, please?
I don't agree with that, because if I look at, again, the place I lived for many years, the distance to walk from Crown, which would be the western edge of Dunbar, to Dunbar Street, is pretty far distance, particularly when it rains, which it does occasionally here. So it's not a walk-friendly distance. Particularly when we find so many of those houses, as evidenced by the declining population, are inhabited by older people who are going to use a car. So why not free up those houses, repopulate them with families, by giving the people who live in those houses today a really nice choice of a house, different kind of housing unit, on a dense street where they have access to transit, they don't have to worry about walking in bad weather, and they have a vibrant commercial area that they can take advantage of.
Can I respond to that? Because I love that you said that. Well, what we found when we actually went out and talked to people and looked at why empty nesters weren't downsizing, it's because they didn't want to go to an arterial. They wanted to downsize within their neighborhood, and there wasn't any opportunities within their neighborhood to downsize in a reasonable housing form for them. And they brought up things like townhouses, row houses, etc. Or even laneway housing was in part of that conversation because they didn't want to go to the arterial. So instead, they stayed in the house much longer than they needed to, and the kids had fewer. But my point is, if you're expecting everybody to make that choice to go on the arterial, it goes back to my main point. Not everybody wants to do that.
Okay, now let's get the audience involved at this point. Does somebody want to? Yeah. Right there. Go ahead. And speak loudly because you don't have a microphone, unlike me who is on a mic.
There's been a lot of discussion, and a lot of it's been facilitated by the Museum of Vancouver, which is great, around the issues of social connectivity and isolation in the city. So I'm wondering why and how does your position contribute to social connectivity in the city?
And try to keep these brief so we get as many as possible. Anybody want to address that? The question really briefly is, what about, we talked a lot about built form, lifestyle, but what about social connectivity, people feeling connected to their neighbors? How does your, either being pro or con this resolution, reassure her concerns about that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think every case in every neighborhood is going to be different in terms of the way it answers that. I can give you an example, though. I mean, this is why I pointed to some of the mid-rise successes in Vancouver, because that's where I think this idea of social connectivity has been very thoroughly considered and delivered on. And I think Southeast Falls Creek is a good example. I do think this idea of actually starting to think about the corridors as much broader and kind of more organic in their form with more public realm is somewhere that is something we should investigate very seriously. I think it deserves some very lengthy discussion. I would welcome more discussions with the design and development community. There used to be, in my opinion, a lot more collaboration across the development community, folks from the city, the design community. Larry put on, I don't know how many charrettes with all these groups around the table. Anyway, I'm just suggesting that to find those solutions, you need to have creative discussions.
I just say quickly?
No,
I don't reach out.
no, we don't have enough time for that.
Okay.
Next? Yeah, Steve.
Okay, we've heard a lot of concepts here, but one word that I have not heard is equity. Why should one neighborhood take increased density that there's going to be a fair amount of resistance to when another neighborhood is exempt from it? Who speaks for the other neighborhoods when a consultation is taking place on a project? Who speaks for those who want to join a neighborhood when the only people at the consultation are those who are already there?
Okay, so Michael and Sam, you are arguing against open all neighborhoods of densification, and so I think his question is directed at you.
Well, the way I see it, if you densify where I suggested along major corridors, and that would touch on many, but not all neighborhoods, you're creating enough choice and enough scale so people will have access to a much greater array of housing choices than they have today. And if we do enough of it, we'll also find some moderation of price increases, if not declines. And at the same time, we'll provide people with access to transit. Transit's a terribly important part of the affordability and housing choice issue, and most people don't have that combination of transit and a more moderate form of housing. And that's a very important part which we tend to lose in the debate. And that's why I stress transit corridors, thoroughfares, and I really stress major nodes, because that's a place we can create huge amounts of density. And if I'm the province, I spend $10 billion on 4 transit lines, and I see my favorite, and Brent and I have been over this before, on Canby and Broadway, there's one great place with 3 corners with 1-story buildings. One has a no-story building because it's got a transit exit. You go down the street to Main, which is going to be a major corridor, and then you go further down the street to Commercial, which is the most accessible part of the whole Lower Mainland. And yet, we have a Safeway and a parking lot. Now, if I spent $10 billion and I live in Williams Lake, I would be upset. So I would like to see a maximum benefit for the people of this region, which means very high density there, and give people the opportunity of great access to great transit and lots of housing choice, different scales, different prices. So to me...
I guess one question that I add on to what you're asking is, you're speaking in terms of trade-offs. So Commercial Drive region, Grandview, Woodland, which is a very lively place around this issue, you're asking them to build towers in certain places and promising trade-offs, neighborhood preservation in other places. Sam, you're a politician. What do you think the odds are that politicians will just hew to that line indefinitely, or don't you think it's just a slippery slope to build those towers?
Well, I'm still in pain after Brent. Can I just say that, because you brought it up, I was ousted because I did a lot of reckless things, but a very important element of my opposition was anti-density, anti-eco-density activists. I lost by 40 votes, so out of 2,000. So a case could be made that I am a casualty of density.
You have post-traumatic density.
I think, I also worry about, the thing that I really loved was our city plan process. We had this process where we went out to the city, we went to east, west, renters, owners, and we got very firm response, very, very clear. 7% wanted to keep on with the standard city, 7% wanted to just send all the growth to the suburbs. 20% wanted to do density everywhere, and 60% wanted neighborhood centers. And I wish we had somehow taken that and done it.
So if there was a city plan, there'd be something more in writing that would maybe protect, that where citizens could see equity at least laid out in some kind of
Well, I
documented
think
fashion.
80% want rezonings within the neighborhoods, especially in core areas.
Well,
Well,
one
what happened was-
of our debates later in the series will be about whether there should be such a city, formalized city plan. I have time for one more comment.
I was part of the first Urbanarium debate in 1990 in the Roundhouse, debated this House resolved that we planned for 10 million. So I want to find out what's for the region. So I want to find out, it's 2041, we've achieved the population targets and so on. What's your plan for the next stage of density, having built the vision that's behind your proposition right now? Because I don't think we're going to nail it. We're going to have this debate in another 25 years.
So what is the question?
The question is the vision, how does the strategy for densifying neighborhoods now relate to the presumed necessary increase in density that we'll be looking at in 25 years' time?
The 25 years after.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, we may all be underwater. And you know, I always tend to think scenarios thinking when it comes to the past a certain time frame, and we haven't even begun to wrestle with the scenarios we'll be facing. So I think all of our assumptions today will seem quaint 25 years from now. But having said that, I don't think any planner should tell you what the plan would be, but I would hope that our Vancouver approach to city making would still be focused on the same principles, which is about working with communities on conversations around density. It's about design first. It's about neighborliness, as Ray taught us. And I think if we've still got those principles 25 years from now, we can still continue to grow in a way that can be considered successful. I think some of those principles have been under threat lately.
okay, well, at this point, it's our first debate, so we're learning, and I think we're going to leave more time for audience contributions next time. But in order to keep to our schedule, I'm now going to come down from on high. I'm going to move over here. And we are going to enter the final segment. Thank you, debaters, and thank you, audience members, for your insightful points. I noticed that Larry Beasley kept wanting to be called on, and Michael Geller. Sorry, guys. You get to say stuff about this a lot. So. So now we've come to the closing arguments. Just find them at the party after. Now we come to the closing arguments. Each debater will have 2 minutes to sum up, and then you, the audience, will vote. Joyce Drohan, you are up.
Well, I think focusing only on corridors and nodes and shopping centers is not going to get us to where we want to be. Partly to Graham's point, I think if you fast forward with that as a notion, you're going to create ever and ever higher densities along those pretty limited areas. And that's why I contend that we need to balance it. We need to actually start thinking in really serious terms about other forms. Brent mentioned a few of them. I do think that we have to think about the city more systemically. I think the city has been, over time, very, very good at that, very creative. I think it would be fair to say that it's taken a step back in the last several years, and that deserves some reflection, and I think it deserves some very hard work. It would be really great to see, as I said before, it would be really great to see the design, the development, and city staff communities come together again, as they have done in the past, to start looking at these issues in really serious terms and applying some design to it. You can't simply talk about these issues without actually investigating it in a really deep and thoughtful way on paper and trying to figure out where you go with it in the future. It's not something that you can I believe it's not something you can actually solve with words.
Thank you very much. Michael Goldberg, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, I won't even use them. I do think that the argument I laid out makes sense because it can accommodate lots of people, can accommodate the people that we know we're going to have, and in particular, it's going to allow, taking Graham's point, 25 years from now, I don't find anybody in dense neighborhoods complaining. The folks who live near me in Cohort seem to like it a lot. People in Yaletown seem to like it a lot. So I think the density issue tends to be really, to quote him, a straw man, a straw person. And once you get into that kind of environment, people tend to like it. And I don't see people fighting against it from the inside. So I think it is an acceptable form. And I think we will obviously have lower densities on thoroughfares, but I really would like to argue for much higher densities than we've been contemplating at these major nodes and in places like shopping centers which can be redeveloped. Finally, I do think it's terribly important that we get much more creative in the uses that we mix. And Brent and I probably could spend the next hour or day going over why I think we have not done a good job mixing housing and offices in the core, and why we should look at industrial land as a source of both jobs and housing to give us new forms of density and new capacity that we won't have otherwise. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Brent Todd, you have 2 minutes.
Well, I'll use the first part of my 2 minutes apologizing to Sam for bringing up the ousting. If it makes you feel any better, I was ousted too. And depending on the circumstances, it can be a real badge of honor. I think that my main message is we need to avoid the false choices of either here or there. I think a really sophisticated conversation about how our city is changing, which we desperately need, should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. It shouldn't use things like spreading evenly or any of those kinds of things. It should talk about an artful, scalpel-like conversation about density in the right places, with the right design, in the right context, for the right reasons. And that's a kind of a much smarter conversation that, frankly, I would really welcome, whether it's in the context of a new citywide plan or just in general. I'm sympathetic to the politicians that feel that they are casualties of density. These are hard conversations, but I can tell you that there are cities around the world that I'm now working with who are inspired by the bravery that we have shown in the past. If we were afraid of the hot topic, we wouldn't have secondary suites across the city. If we were afraid of the hot topic, we would have never brought laneway housing to council, and we have over 2,100 of them. And many of the townhouse projects that have become models, we do every scale of density, in my opinion, in the city pretty darn well. Not just the tall towers that get all the attention. So I think a lot of them, Bruce Corner, I'm looking at Bruce Hayden, there are great examples of all sorts of different scales of density, and we've got to, in a brave way, embrace the conversation, have a smart conversation about it, and come out the other end with a lot of different options and ideas, not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you very much. Sam Sullivan, you get the last word, but only 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, just a shout out to Leslie Van Duzer, Richard Enriquez, and all the board members who put this together, and a special shout out to Ray Spaxman. Came up with the idea that we wanted a more sophisticated discussion, and I see the fruits of his labor are still being felt today. I think what happened in Paris just a few weeks ago was very, very important. The issue of climate change and governments actually taking this seriously, and we're going to have to actually do something about it. I do think when I see the Metro Vancouver plan that most of the density is planned for the worst places in terms of environmental outcomes, in terms of greenhouse gas and habitat loss, which are the two big ones. I think we need a political strategy, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that there are very great challenges in even doing modest things, you know, calling four-story hyperdensity go. Even our very progressive moderator is going to be fighting us. You know, I have so many neighborhoods, so many neighbors. You know, I live in Hilltown, and I love the fact that we're getting more density. And I think, wow, what's this going to do for my ability to get great restaurants and good amenities? And so many of my neighbors move from these suburban areas of the city and love it. They get in downtown and somehow they're fighting density in their own neighborhoods, and then when they get to Yaletown and downtown, Full Harbor, they love it and see the benefits. So I think it's just a challenge. Anything where you're bringing change is a challenge for politicians, people that have to actually make those decisions.
I'll have to stop you right there. I have to challenge you. Okay, and now we come to the moment when you, by voting, crown the winning team. Remember this cyberspace address that so frustrated you when you tried to get there and do something with it? Well, try again, you know, and if that doesn't work, we have more paper ballots. We have the results. The results are in. We've compared the vote to the one you took at the beginning of the evening. First, I'm going to give you the raw numbers. They are, at the beginning of the evening, let me remind you. Well, no. Pro, for the resolution, 127. Against the resolution, 46. At the beginning of the evening, it was pro 145, and it was 39 against. And what it means is that the winner is those who are opposed to the resolution. It's my pleasure to present Team Con with the Smart Cities Award. Well fought, and wear your t-shirt proudly. And of course you can keep tonight's conversation going via social media that way. Thanks again to the Urbanarium, UBC-SALA, the Museum of Vancouver, Rethink, all of our incredible volunteers, and there are a lot of them, and our excellent debaters. Thank you very, very much.